Welcome to module number 2. In this module, we will focus on service characteristics in hospitality and tourism organizations. Not only will we talk about what makes services unique, but we will also talk about different strategies that hospitality companies pick up in order to deal with these characteristics of services. On your screen, you see logos of 3 very famous companies, including Starbucks, Southwest, and the Ritz-Carlton. My question to all of you is, what's special about these companies? Obviously, these are amongst the most favorite companies of consumers around the world, but these companies also have very high favorable rate on the social media as well as in general media. These companies are one of the most recognized companies in the world. Why? The question is, why do companies favor these brands? The simple answer is obviously because of their marketing, because they keep customers at the base or at the center of their marketing campaigns. In part 1 of this module, we will be talking about service culture. Like I mentioned, the companies on the previous slide, what's special about them is keeping customers at the core of their business operations. In marketing terms, we call it service culture. What is service culture? If we dissect the word service culture, we get 2 different words, service and culture. What is service? Service is simply a valuable action that is performed to fulfill a demand. In many cases, companies do provide services in return for some value that they get from the customers. What is culture? Generally, we call culture as a collective set of beliefs and attitudes of a particular group. In some cases, we have cultures around the countries. In some cases, we have subcultures around specific groups in countries. For instance, in the US, we have Latino culture. We also have Asian culture. We have South Asian culture. So all these cultures are groups of attitudes. These are collection of attitudes and beliefs of a particular group. Now, if we bring together these words, service culture, that would simply mean that a system of values and beliefs in an organization where they keep customer at the core, where the focus is on customer quality, where the focus is on providing customer value. Now, usually it starts from the top of the business and then it trickles down to the middle level all the way to the bottom level. Usually from the top of the company, when the company focuses on service quality and providing value to the customers, they will then select and retain or recruit the right type of employees who would then focus on ensuring customer satisfaction, in addition to having proper service standards and quality criteria. Part 2 of this module focuses on services characteristics. What do we mean by services characteristics? So these are characteristics that make services different from products. Now, one core issue in hospitality and tourism marketing is that hospitality and tourism marketing focuses on services. It's very different from product marketing. And services characteristics are the characteristics that distinguish services from products. Generally, we have 4 different types of service characteristics, which include intangibility, inseparability, perishability, and variability. In the upcoming slides, we will discuss each of them in detail and then also discuss the strategies that companies adopt in order to deal with these characteristics. The first characteristic of services is called intangibility. Intangibility simply means things that cannot be seen, touched, felt, smelled, or tasted. This is one of the most commonly cited characteristic of services. Usually, when we have physical products, before we consume them, we can go and test them. But in case of services, we cannot do that. Now, usually for products, when we test them before consumption, it gives us an idea of the quality of the product. But in services, it is a little bit different. Usually, like I mentioned, services also have, or hospitality and tourism services, in addition to tangible and intangible products, also have the memories and experiences as a product category. So when it comes to intangibility, because there's a lot of focus in hospitality and tourism on memories and experiences, it brings a lot of focus on the intangible nature of services, because consumers cannot try them before the consumption. So in that situation, companies have a big challenge of how to ensure the quality standards or how to portray the quality standards of services since they are intangible. Usually, like I said, in products, consumers seek tangible cues in order to determine the quality of products, but in services, it is not possible. It's a little bit different. The second characteristic of services that distinguish them from products is inseparability. Now, when we talk about products, usually products are consumed first or they are developed first. So think about it. If there's any product that you are using, it was produced first, then it came to you and then you consumed it. Imagine that you went to Publix or Walmart, you got a frozen pizza that was already produced. You brought it home, then you consumed it. So in products, the production and consumption is different. In services, however, it's a little bit different. Let's assume the example of staying at a hotel. So when you go to a hotel room and you stay there, your stay is the production of service and the consumption of service at the same time. You cannot produce the service first and consume it later. It has to be at the same time. And that's where inseparability comes into the picture. Now, when we talk about service environments, it's not only the service provider and the service consumer. There's also other consumers in the picture. It's also the physical environment. It's also the customer to staff interaction. So there's a lot of factors that come into picture when we talk about inseparability as a challenge and as a characteristic of services. The third characteristic of services is variability. Now, when we talk about products, let's assume you bought an iPhone 14, you bought it today, you bought it last week, you bought it a month ago, or you are going to buy it the next month. Every time you buy iPhone 14, the quality would be consistent. When it comes to services, the quality of services cannot be consistent, because when it comes to services, you have the service provider, you have the service consumer, you have the time of service delivery. And because all these things can be different, that can then change the way services are produced or delivered. That's where invariability comes into the picture. At any given time, if you get a quality service, it's not necessary that another time you will get the same quality of service. That is exactly what invariability in services is called, and that's the third characteristic of service. The fourth and the last characteristic of service is perishability. So perishability is a very simple concept to understand. Let me show you something. So I got this Diet Coke an hour ago. I started drinking it. And when I was drinking it, I drank half of it, I put the lid on, and I didn't finish it. I just left it here, and after my class, I'm going to consume it. So for products, it's a simple idea. If you cannot complete or if you cannot finish the product, you can store it, you can consume it later. For services, it cannot be done. You cannot go to a hotel, book the room for one night, wake up in the middle of the night, tell the front desk that you only stayed in the room for 6 hours and you are going to use it another time. You're going to come back, use another 18 hours at another day. You can't do that. That is perishability. Means that if you cannot use the service at one time, it will perish. If a hotel room has 100 rooms and they sold only 60 rooms tonight, that means those 40 rooms are lost forever. You cannot make up for those 40 rooms again. That's the concept of perishability, which makes services different from products. And that's the last characteristic of services. Welcome to part 3 of this module. So in the previous part, we talked about the characteristics of services and how they are a challenge for service providers. In this part, we'll talk about different strategies that the companies adopt in order to deal with the challenges of these different characteristics. Like I said, the first characteristic was intangibility. Services cannot be seen, they cannot be touched. That's a challenge. So how companies can deal with this challenge? By managing differentiation. Number one, remember that services cannot be patented. It's not like a product. You cannot patent a service. However, you can patent the way you deliver the service. So in some cases, like Royal Caribbean has a robotic arm that makes drinks for you on the cruise ship. You also have companies where the robots deliver food for you. So the way services are delivered is a way to differentiate yourselves, and it's also a tangible cue in order to deal with the intangibility of the service. In some cases, Companies focus on differentiating themselves based on the people they have, like the staff that they have. In some cases, it can be the physical environment, and in some cases, it can be the way services are delivered. Companies can also create promotional materials in a tangible way in order to deal with intangibility. For example, menus in the restaurants or employees' appearance, the way their uniforms are. Hooters is a very good example of how they use their employees' uniforms or things in order to differentiate themselves. Of course, you can think different things about it, but that's an example from hospitality industry. Then you also have the physical servicescape, the decoration of the organizations. Las Vegas Strip is a very good example of it, where different casinos are using different type of attractions on the property in order to differentiate themselves. Everything in hospitality relates to the image. So whatever companies do to differentiate themselves, this is also very important to understand that nothing should get them away from their image. Everything that is done needs to deliver a consistent image. The second and the third characteristic of service was inseparability and variability. Service provider and service consumer cannot be separated, and at any two given time frames, the service cannot be of consistent quality. How can we deal with that? So many companies are dealing with that by having service quality standards or service quality control. Quality is normally measured by how well consumers' expectations are met. Companies put different type of tools in place in order to see how consumers' expectations are met. Companies have feedback forms, they consistently go after customers, send them surveys and different type of things to see how well their expectations were met. That's one way companies can deal with how variable the service was and how quality standards can be put in place. Companies can also try actively and effectively to deal with customer complaints. Now, one of the most frustrating things for customers is where they complain about a service failure or how their expectations were not met and never reached out by the organization. I recently traveled to Croatia for a conference, and coming back, one of the airlines broke my luggage bag. I went to the luggage claim area in the airport, and they gave me a paper to contact them through email because they were not doing it in the airport, which was in itself very frustrating because my broken bag was in my hand. Anyways, I came back, I took photos, I sent the feedback with all the information that was requested in the form, and then I was reached out after 3 days with another email from the company, from the airline, asking me to give them all those details I input in the form again. Again, you can imagine how frustrating that was. I did that again, not to hear anything for the next 3 weeks. After 3 weeks, I went to the portal where I logged in my complaint to see that my request was denied, but I was never told through email or anything why was it denied. Now, for the last 2 weeks, I'm trying to get in touch with the company through different channels on social media or whatnot. No response. So you can think how frustrating can it be for consumers where they are complaining and the companies are claiming that they have this system in place in order to deal with these challenges of services, but that in itself is a service failure. So, all in all, the only way to deal with inseparability and variability of services is to make sure to understand what makes consumers have problems, why their expectations are not met, and then dealing with those feedback seriously. The last challenge of services is perishability. Now, perishability means that services cannot be stored. So the easiest and the most common way of dealing with this is by managing demand. Companies do it in different ways. One of the ways that companies deal with it is by managing the price. You all must have heard of things like happy hours. So on the slow times, companies do have happy hours to bring in more foot traffic to sell some of their products. There's also queue management. Queue management is where, when you go to different stores, there's queue management and you can sell more stuff during the low hours. Companies also cross-train their employees so that when the business is low, when it's low season, then you can reduce your cost by using your employees that are in place. All in all, these are the strategies, or revenue management, for example, is also another strategy that companies use in order to maximize their revenue when the demands are low. All in all, these are different strategies that companies use in order to deal with perishability. So to wrap up, In this module, we talked about what is service culture. We also talked about the different characteristics of services that make them different from products. And lastly, we talked about the different strategies that companies put in place in order to deal with these challenges.